If you have ever gone to the beach, you have seen ripples in the sand. The action of the water lapping into the shore creates them when it pushes some sand away in a pattern. The bigger the waves, the bigger the ripples. You can see that these ripples are small when there is almost no wave movement. Even underwater, you can see the ripples in the sand. From this, we can infer that water will move land, or earth, or soil when they meet. The more energy that the water has, the more land that it can move. Let's watch one of my favorite engineers on YouTube explain this interaction a little bit clearer.
Ocean currents move beaches constantly, but the biggest component of coastal erosion is waves. That's why I've assembled a simple wave generator here in my garage. If you've ever played in the ocean or even in a wave pool, you've probably been surprised at the power behind them. Just like waves wash around swimmers with no hesitation, they can also wash away the coastline. Simply put, waves are destructive because water is heavy. This isn't exactly a precise law of physics, but it is a good rule of thumb in engineering. When you bash heavy stuff against something, it's liable to break. When you combine this helpful hint with the fact that a good proportion of coastlines are made of not very erosion-resistant, loose sandy beaches, you get a recipe for serious erosion. What happens along coastlines across the world is mostly a physical process, where the relentless crashing of water exerts pressure that can separate soil particles and even splinter and remove pieces of rock. A single wave can smash tons of force into a small area, easily washing away loose sediment or wearing away at rocks. Waves also carry sand and sediment from the seabed, which gets bashed against the rocks, grinding, scraping, and chipping them over time. In some cases, the seawater can actually dissolve the rocks themselves, a process called chemical weathering. This destructive environment certainly creates some serious erosion, but it gets even worse. All of these processes are amplified during storm events like hurricanes and typhoons, which produce some of the fastest sustained winds on Earth. That high wind leads to high waves, which accelerate erosion way beyond normal levels. That would be fine if the coast wasn't such a popular place to put stuff. And by stuff I mean houses, commercial buildings, apartments, condos, etc. Basically cities and all the expensive infrastructure that comes with them. Erosion literally steals away from the shore, carrying it piece by piece out to sea or to be deposited somewhere else along the shore. That means development nearest to the coast is constantly at risk of being claimed by the sea. In addition to that, beaches support massive local economies, providing millions of jobs and billions of dollars of economic activity. As I mentioned before, people love the beach, and they'll spend lots of money to see and hear and swim in those waves. So, just by adding humans to the mix, what was this perfectly natural geologic process of coastal erosion is now a certified hazard in many places, threatening structures along the shore and the livelihood of huge portions of coastal population. That's bad, and we don't want it to happen, so over time we've developed some solutions to try to mitigate these adverse impacts. A lot of engineered solutions to coastal erosion involve armoring the shore with structures like seawalls, bulkheads, and revetments. These involve building some kind of hardened structure that can withstand the continued impacts from waves. Some seawalls even include a recurve to make sure the waves don't crash over the top and erode the area beyond the wall. Another protective structure, called a groin, protrudes into the sea to reduce the currents directly along the shore and retain the soil and sand. Finally, breakwaters are structures built parallel to shorelines to break up waves before they make it to shore. Hard armoring often provides a more long-term solution to erosion, but it also creates a lot of unintended consequences. Smooth seawalls like concrete reflect waves rather than absorbing them. This is not ideal because waves can be sent towards other parts of the coast, worsening erosion at the edges of walls or further downshore. Improperly designed groins can also worsen erosion on the downdrift side. These structures can also affect the quality of habitat in the sea, creating environmental challenges.
So we just watched a conversation about how to engineer some ways to keep erosion from eating away the shoreline. The basic idea is to reduce the amount of force that the water has when it makes it to shore. There are three ways, and those three ways are to make a hard structure wall along the edge of the shoreline called a seawall. Um, this is actually the same sort of way that here, Washington, D.C., manages the Potomac and Anacostia rivers. If you've ever been to Yards Park or East Potomac Park, or actually kind of most of the shoreline, especially on the city side as opposed to the Virginia or like the Anacostia Park side, you've seen the walls. They are just retaining walls that keep the water from eating away at the shoreline. The second way is to make that same sort of wall, but move it further away from the shoreline. You can see something like this at many beaches on the Chesapeake Bay. Basically, the idea is that if this wall um, exists, the water bounces off the wall, right? The force of the wave hits the wall and is dissipated. Okay, you absorb the energy and deflect the energy of the water before it makes it to shore. The third way is to make hard structures that are perpendicular to the shore. These act a lot like the rumble strips that you find on the highway. They slow the water down as it runs along the shoreline. Let's take a look at Atlantic City, New Jersey. Last week we actually looked at an island that was had eroded away in the center of the channel right in downtown Atlantic City. They have these type of finger piers as well. Let's take a look. We find similar sorts of structures when we look at how engineers try and control erosion that happens on a river as well. The idea is the same. Create hard structures that absorb and deflect the energy from moving water so that it does not destroy the surface that we are trying to protect. In fact, for Parks Week, I showed you some of that engineering in Watts Branch Park. So the city has done a lot of work on this section of Watts Branch to try and keep the stream in its normal bed. So over here, you have the shallower side, the inside of the dam. So rock and sand and pebbles get deposited there. When the rain comes in strong, it flows against this bank, which is why this is concrete, and it has all of these, looks like sandbags that have been reinforced with the concrete. That's all there to keep the stream from eating away at this edge, because if it did, eventually the stream would end up over there. That's a Wendy's, there's a McDonald's right there. This is Minnesota Avenue and Nanny Helen Burroughs. So it's important the stream stays here and doesn't end up over there. Again, same basic idea. Hard structures on the outside corner where the energy of the running water will be deposited when the stream is flowing strongly. If the inside curve of that, if the outside curve, right, because the water flows and the energy goes to the outside, if the outside curve of Watts Branch was not reinforced like that, eventually the stream would cut through the park and end up undermining the intersection of Minnesota Ave and Nanny Helen Burroughs. Right? So to keep that from happening, to keep the stream where it is, engineers have built these retaining walls in the park. The biggest problem with trying so strongly to control what is a series of natural phenomena is that when these hard structures fail, they often fail catastrophically. First, let's take a look at a dam in Oroville, California that almost collapsed a few years ago. This dam created the second largest reservoir in the state of California And they had a whole bunch of rain, like a lot of rain, followed by another storm with a lot of rain. The lake filled up. When they went to release some of the water out the overflow, which is designed to keep pressure down, they discovered there were cracks and undermining there, and they came very, very close to losing the entire dam. Let's take a look. The collapse of the Oroville Dam would have been truly catastrophic for California and for the rest of the United States of America. California is a very, very large state that produces a lot of energy and a lot of food for the rest of the United States. Had the Oroville Dam collapse, it would have shut down large parts of the state for an indefinite amount of time, which would have been bad. Luckily, it didn't, and engineers have worked hard since then to identify and fix any other underlying problems in this dam, and have put in the time and effort to look at other smaller dams around the state. We are not always that lucky, though, and sometimes our critical infrastructure fails and causes untold mountains of destruction and suffering. This is what happened during Hurricane Katrina in 2005. New Orleans lies at the mouth of the Mississippi River on what's called a delta plain. Delta plains are where the rivers meet the sea, and they tend to be you have a river that's moving in a straight line, and then a delta plain is often very flat, and the river starts to spread. It forms kind of a triangular shape as the water spreads out and meets the sea. Naturally, river deltas change over time. Storms and river flow erode the sediment all over the time. Okay, as a storm surge comes down from upriver, and remember the Mississippi drains most of the continental United States, so most of the water comes down through the area. As you have storm floods of water, it washes away that soil. That's why the path changes. And then also sometimes coming down are sediments that come down from erosion all the way upriver, and those will deposit sand, and so the deltas are constantly getting carved away and getting replaced and getting carved away and replaced. The deltas are by nature changeable. This is the nature of not just the Mississippi River Delta, but all deltas. We put a major city in the Mississippi River Delta, New Orleans. And we did that because the Mississippi River connects the majority of the United States, including way up almost to Canada. We can ship goods up and down the Mississippi River very easily. So when the United States was young, having a port down in New Orleans that could ship goods from the interior of the United States around the world and vice versa was super important. So we built a city on the Mississippi River Delta. We put permanent structures and neighborhoods and homes and businesses on this delta, and the fact that deltas naturally change means that something's got to give. That doesn't work, right? So we walled off the river, right? Put these hard structures in, put retaining walls to try and channel the flow of the river from overarching the banks and flooding the city and destroying the city. A lot of these are earthworks called levees, which is just basically a big mound of earth. So if the water floods up, it floods up behind this wall of earth, and then it can slowly drain away. So these levees are not stone retaining walls, they're earth retaining walls, though they are hard surfaces in some place. But the idea is they keep the river over there, and the rest of New Orleans can happen over there, right? And New Orleans is not the only place this is, but this works until it doesn't. And when it doesn't, that small little failure can amplify and cause a much larger and more catastrophic failure. We saw that last week with the kids who built that earthen dam. It kept all of that water back, but once a little crack appeared, that crack amplified and you had a raging torrent of water coming through. This is what happened in 2005. There was a huge hurricane that brought 8 to 10 inches of rain across the entire area. Remember, that rain is also going to collect and amplify. So 8 to 10 inches of rain gets magnified to feet of water flow. Some regions, some areas in New Orleans area got 15 inches of water, right, falling out of the sky. The hurricane did a lot of damage, but the flooding occurred 2 or 3 days later when all of that water then started to come back and drain into the New Orleans area. There's a lake called Lake Pontchartrain, I think it is, just north of New Orleans. That filled up. Some of the levee walls broke, and water flooded the city. Okay, the levee system broke down, and all of this water flooded into New Orleans. Right? Very big and complicated problem. Lots of people lost their lives. It was a failure in lots of ways. The U.S. government did not do a great job helping the people in New Orleans. And we're not going to get too much into it because it's a very complicated problem, but let's take a short look at what happened.
When Hurricane Katrina struck New Orleans, entire neighborhoods vanished under 20 feet of water. The devastation ranks as one of America's worst natural disasters, but also one of the worst man-made disasters. That's because since its early days, New Orleans has been sinking. The soil in and near New Orleans is a tenuous combination of silt, sand, and clay. Over time, the soil compacts and sinks. Before the Mississippi River Delta was developed, the river flooded regularly. Fresh silt from the floodwaters replaced the sinking ground and kept the land above sea level. But New Orleans is built to keep the river out. High walls called levees have been erected around the city to keep rising river levels at bay. They have also kept out the silt and sediments. Without the renewing sediments, New Orleans continues, ever so slightly, to sink. Its present rate is 3 feet every 100 years. Parts of New Orleans today are 8 feet below sea level. If another storm surge like Katrina's reaches the levees, New Orleans will again be underwater. The odds of another flood are increasing because the ground under New Orleans is not all that's shrinking. So are the surrounding wetlands. Every hour, another 2 acres of wetlands disappears under the sea. Like the sinking of New Orleans, the reasons are largely man-made. Canals dug through the wetlands increase erosion and destroy habitat, and levees help funnel the silt out into the Gulf before it can be absorbed by the coastal wetlands. Ironically, it is the wetlands, not the levees, that truly protect New Orleans from the sea. Every 3 miles of wetland absorbs a foot of a storm surge, acting as Mother Nature's insurance policy against hurricanes. Since 1930, Louisiana has lost over 1,900 square miles of wetlands. By 2050, many barrier islands will disappear altogether. New Orleans is still sinking. Unless something is done, the Big Easy will slip beneath the sea, with or without another hurricane.
So Hurricane Katrina is an example of what can happen if we don't change how we think about managing water. One of the realities of our future is that with climate change, a number of cities are going to have to deal with water as a problem moving forward. In 2012, I believe it was, Hurricane Andrew struck New York City. The city was mostly fine, but parts of the city and the outlying areas flooded in a way they hadn't ever flooded before. Caused a lot of damage to subway systems that we are still dealing with now because salt water is very corrosive. And New York City lies right at the mouth of the Hudson River and is going to have to deal with these types of things more in the future. As the sea level rises, cities like New York, Miami down in Florida, New Orleans again, have to figure out ways to deal with it. Putting hard structures in works, but it amplifies that power, right? What happened in New Orleans is all of that water, instead of being allowed to flow, spread out and dissipate its energy. That's what a river delta is. That energy got amplified because the hard structures channeled it, caused it to kind of speed up and collect. And so you have all of this potential energy building up in Lake Pontchartrain, and when it collapsed, all of that energy just caused more and more collapse and caused all of that water to spread across the city, which caused all of the problems. Okay, same with Lake Oroville. All of that potential energy behind the dam caused all of that chaos and destruction, and it could have been much worse. Okay, luckily it wasn't. One of the things people are trying to do is figure out other ways to manage these type of flooding events. One of the things about New Orleans specifically is if there were lots of the salt marshes that used to exist around New Orleans were still around, those would have slowed the floodwaters, those would have absorbed lots of the floodwaters, and it would have kept the city from ever having to deal with that much rainwater and storm surge and all of that coming down. Next week we're going to start looking at ways that humans are trying to manage water and erosion. Some on a very large scale, okay, like city level New Orleans, some at a very small scale, like I have a rain barrel and other things in my yard that help to keep the water from ending up in our stormwater collection system. All right, but that will be next week. Have a great week, my friends, and I will see you next time.